by putting legislation like this in place, Madam Speaker. Not by putting legislation like this in place that penalizes people in Nova Scotia who are not the evil bankers in Wall Street, just your regular small business Nova Scotian, regular Nova Scotian small business owner. You know, if you want to carry the big stick, why not walk the walk, as they say? And I would love to see it, and I say that in good spirits, because there's always opportunity. And if you really want to make a difference, Madam Speaker, instead of coming at it from a piece of legislation like this and saying, well, we're not going to do the work, we're just going to scrape our little piece out of whoever's doing the work, that's not leadership. That's not leadership. And you know, I think we've all received that email at one time or another about I think it was the ant and the centipede or something. It doesn't really matter, but he was talking about how one worked hard all year to collect the provisions for the winter, and the other did nothing towards that, but wanted a fair share of it when the winter came. And I guess, Madam Speaker, the point I'm making is that leadership is not what we see in this bill. If you want to better redistribute wealth in the province, and if organized labor wants to do that, why not? Why not show real leadership and use your knowledge if you need to gain investment from another party. If you put forward a good business plan, the same as a Nova Scotian business owner would do, you'll get investment support. If you need some kind of expertise that you don't have, you can hire it. Point being, Madam Speaker, this bill is not leadership. Leadership would be actually doing something about redistributing wealth. And so I encourage organized labor in the province to think about that. So with those remarks, with those remarks, I'm going to start to wind down. And I have to have another glass of water here, another drink of water. 1.5. I'm getting a bit parched, Madam Speaker. But I say that in good spirits because, you know, we'll come and go from here. I think the average life of a politician is 7 years. I'm sure we'll still be dealing with these matters 20 or 50 years from now, but what's important is right now. And that's why we've called this hoist today, because we want people to look at this and realize that this is not the answer. This is not the direction we need to be going in today or 50 years from now. Let's take our own future, put it in our own hands, and if we want to redistribute wealth, let's do it in a way that's honourable and that's fair to everybody, and that's not going to be harmful to Nova Scotia business. So with that, Madam Speaker, I will conclude my remarks.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Oh, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm certainly glad to be able to take my time here tonight to add to the discussion about the motion that's before the House, this hoist motion, where we would put this bill off for 6 months to allow time for consideration of what's going on. And I want to start off my remarks by saying that I was glad to hear my colleague from Cape Breton South say that he and his party were in agreement that this is not a good bill for the province of Nova Scotia, and indeed that they supported the hoist, and that they did not think that this bill was going to serve any purpose for the province of Nova Scotia. And I think they're right on that, and we agree on that. I also wanted to say that one of the reasons that I think it's so important to put this bill off for 6 months, Madam Speaker, is indeed to allow small business the opportunity to get prepared to come and talk about what it is they don't like. Now, our member from Cape Breton South, he said, you know, it doesn't matter because there's a majority government and we need to get to law amendments. And we do need to get to law amendments, Madam Speaker. We need to get there, and we do need time. But there's something that we have to consider. A lot of the small business owners here in the province of Nova Scotia, they're the ones that open the door in the morning and lock the door at night. They're the ones who put in 10, 14, 16 hours a day. And they need time to make arrangements so that they can come here to Halifax to make their presentations to law amendments. Now, it would be really good, Madam Speaker, if indeed we, as a House, could go around the different communities, similar to what they're doing with the Boundaries Commission for the Elections Act. We should be going out and we should be in Yarmouth where the small business person is and listening to what the small business person there has to say. And we should be in the Valley and listening to them. We should also be on the South Shore and Amherst and all parts of this province and Cape Breton. Because, Madam Speaker, it is an added burden that we are putting on the small business of this province, telling them that they have to travel to Halifax in order to plead their case, in order for them to tell us what their fears are. Now, normally, Madam Speaker, they could go to their representative, their MLA, and tell them, we do not like this for this, and this reason. But unfortunately, as pointed out by the member from Cape Breton South, the government has a majority. And it doesn't appear from where we sit on this side of the House that the people who are not members of Cabinet are hearing or listening to the small businesses in their community. And that's sad, Madam Speaker. That is truly sad. Because in order for this bill to get a real hearing, in order for the business people in this province who have made this province what it is today, to give them the opportunity to come forward and state their case, make it known to those that are in this House making the legislation. They should have as much time as possible to do that. And I guess, Madam Speaker, one would have to ask, if this legislation as presented to us by the government is so great, it's such a good thing today, well, then we have to ask the question, would it not be a good thing in 6 months' time, after people have had an opportunity to be heard, to be listened to, instead of ramming it through because, as the Deputy Premier said, well, we've got a majority government, so it's inevitable. We know what's going to happen. The reality is, if we were sincere, this 52 members of this House, we would take the time, we would travel around this province, and we would hear people and not put an extra burden on them. Some small business people, Madam Speaker, cannot leave their business to tell us what their problem is. And of course, they're worried about what the ramifications may be if they speak out too loudly. And I look at my own community, and I just think of the changes I've seen in the time that I've been there. And you start in an area like Marion Bridge, and you drive to St. Peter's, and you go through a community like Gabrouse. At one time had 2 small stores, 2 small businesses. And then you come up to Gabrouse Lake. There was another small business there, a small store. And another guy had a gas pump, and that was a small business, and he used to make some money on that. And then you go to Forshaw, and in Forshaw they had 2 stores and a gas pump. They were all small businesses. They were the reason why our communities were unique. They were the reason why people were able to stay in our communities. And you go on from Forshaw to Framboise, and there was another store. And it was a booming business. It employed 5 or 6 people because there were a couple of pulp contractors there, and they were buying all their food and supplies from that one store. And now, with what's going on with NewPage, those kind of things don't happen as easy. And then you drive on again to a place called Grand River. And again, a place that had 2 stores and 2 sets of gas pumps, and people were working in small business. Now, some will say, well, you know, there's a lot of challenges out there in the small business. And there are. But you know, Madam Speaker, you have to be careful. You have to be careful of the type of legislation you put in place, or those small businesses, the very fabric that's made our communities so strong and made our province what it is today, will disappear. And Madam Speaker, once those small businesses disappear, they're not coming back. It's like trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube. It's impossible to do. What we need to do is be sure that it's the people here who were elected by the people of the province of Nova Scotia. And they weren't elected by big business, and they weren't elected by big unions. They were elected by residents who said, we want you to go and we want you to take our views to Halifax and make sure that we have a good, strong province. And Madam Speaker, that's not what this legislation is going to do. As a matter of fact, we're told by people who are in small business that this probably could destroy some of the very fabric that we're talking about. And I don't want to be called an alarmist, and I don't want people to say, that's not so. It simply isn't true. What I want is to be sure that people get a fair hearing, that the people who said, you go up there and you represent me, that they are heard, and that they get a sound hearing by a group of people in this building. And Madam Speaker, I think that the intentions of everyone in this building, all the 52 members, are honorable. But sometimes, Madam Speaker, some people in this building, in our parties, don't stand up and speak for the ones who brought them. We have a saying around home, you know, you dance with the one that brung you. And the one that brought us to this house was the electors. It was the people in our constituency. And when I was home last weekend, I was at many different community events. And there was person after person said to me, what's this bill about? Why do we need that? I don't understand it. What's it all about? And you know, you try to explain it. And they say, well, that doesn't sound like we need that. Why are we doing that? Well, you know, I can tell you that if I was to take a poll in Cape Breton West, the majority of small businesses there would say, this is not necessary. We have a business. We have our employees. They're loyal to us. They're good workers. One of the reasons that we are so successful as a province, one of the reasons that Irving was able to bring in this giant contract for shipbuilding was the quality of the workforce that's known right across this nation. People know the quality of work that are delivered by Nova Scotians. When you go out to Alberta, to the tar sands, out in that area, when they hear you're from Nova Scotia, you'll get a job right away because they know you have a strong work ethic. And there's probably nobody in this house that doesn't have anybody there. Somebody working in that oil patch. Now, the unfortunate part is since this government took power, there's more of them working out there than there are home. And if we pass this type of legislation, we have an opportunity to see even more go away. And that's not what we want. Because when people have to go away to work, there's a cost, Madam Speaker. There is a true cost. And that cost is not just about the economy. It's the cost on the families of the province of Nova Scotia. It's the cost on the children of our province. Because when you have a unit where the wage earner has to be away for 2 and 3 weeks or months at a time, there is an effect on the children. And there is an effect on the family. And Madam Speaker, I don't think that's what anybody in this house wants. I don't think anybody here wants to see that kind of thing deteriorate the quality of life that we have here in the province of Nova Scotia. I think, Madam Speaker, like many here, we've all had opportunities to go away, and we made our choice. We decided we wanted to stay in Nova Scotia and be part of a Nova Scotia that we're so proud of. But now, we're looking at a piece of legislation that could change that, could make things different, could make it harder. And you know, Madam Speaker, that's really not what we need. So the whole idea of having an extra 6 months to look at this piece of legislation, to allow more people to have their input, to make sure that everybody who wants to have their say can have their say, is not a strange request. And as I said earlier, Madam Speaker, and I'll say it again, if this legislation is so great and grand now, then it will probably be no different 6 months down the road. The difference will be that people will have had an opportunity to express their interests, their concerns, the reasons why they don't like it, or maybe, just maybe, the reasons why they do like it. But if we, as a host, as the people that represent them, don't give them that opportunity, then are we not, Madam Speaker, are we not failing them? My answer to that would be, yes, we are. We're failing them. So I know there are people lining up to come right now to law amendments, and there'll be more that will come, but there'll be many that can't. We've sent people around this province to hear the concerns that they have when it comes to boundaries in the election. Why do we do that, Madam Speaker? Well, I think we did it because we all believe that it's important to see the full picture, to hear what everybody has to say. So there's 9 members of our House traveling around this province, listening to what people have to say, hearing what they have to say, and they're going to come back and make an opinion as to what they heard and how is the best way to move forward in putting together the guidelines for the Commission. Well, if that is what we need to do when we have to listen to people who are looking at how and where and how many people they were going to vote for, would it not make sense? Would it not be a real stretch of leap to believe that indeed why the business shouldn't be heard? Now, I'm a pretty simple guy. And I think, and you know, I got a couple of Snickers from the other side already, and I don't really care. You know why? I'll tell you why I don't care. Because I'm who I am. And it doesn't matter what they think of me. What matters is that collectively we do the right thing. And the right thing is to listen to the population and the businesses of this province, so that we can, in 10 years or 20 years, or when my grandchildren or your grandchildren get older, they'll have a province to call home. They'll have a place that they can find work, and they'll have a reason to stand proud and say, I'm from Nova Scotia. But now, Madam Speaker, all I would like to see is the opportunity for everyone to have their say. And they can prove the government is right or the opposition is right. But isn't that what we're supposed to be all about? Isn't that what the goal is supposed to be? Is to make sure that we're doing what is right. I don't think anybody elects people to tell them what's good for them. I think that we elect people to make sure they do the right thing. We are here to listen and bring those concerns forward. And we've been trying to do that time and time again. And yet, we hear from the other side, that's simply not true. Well, Madam Speaker, the numbers speak for themselves. We see some of the highest power rates in the country. Some businesses, because of those power rates, are saying we may not be able to survive. And you know, Madam Speaker, you say, well, what does that have to do with the bill? Well, it's the very fact that something as simple as power rates can determine whether a business can survive will tell you how fragile it is to operate a business, how hard it is, and that there's so many things that you have to have your finger on in order to make sure that the doors are open and that people have work to come to. So if their power rates are going up and then they don't know if they have any say in first contract arbitration about what the wages are going to be, that's an unknown. How are they supposed to be able to survive? I mean, nobody gets into business to lose money. And I can tell you that this province can't survive without people and businesses. And yes, it's important that everybody is getting a fair shake, and everybody is trying to make sure that people get a good wage and a fair wage. But Madam Speaker, as my colleague from Victoria the Lake said in the early days of this debate, if there are no employers, there are no employees. And for that reason, we have to really consider where we're at. I just wonder sometimes, Madam Speaker, if the member for Guysborough Cheat Harbour has talked to the people in his constituency and asked them, what do you think about this? Because there's a very rural part of this province, and businesses in those areas are struggling to survive, and we need to know what they're saying. Or people who represent the Eastern Shore, have they talked to the people that they represent and to the small businesses? And if I look across at the government side of the benches, there are people over there who were small businessmen, people who ran businesses, people who should understand how important it is to be in touch with reality. I would say to you, Madam Speaker, there's not an employer in this province that won't tell you that one of the reasons that they're successful in their business is because of the quality of the employees they have. And each and every one of those business people do the very best that they can with what they have to make sure that the persons that are working for them are treated fairly and get paid as fairly as they can possibly do it, so that the business can make sure it survives, and at the same time, the doors stay open. Because it's no good, Madam Speaker, to be able to say, well, when I worked, I made $15 an hour, but I don't work anymore. It's more important to say, I work 12 months of the year, and I make $12, but I know every week I'm going to have a paycheck. So if we're going to put small business into jeopardy, let's be sure we're doing it for the right reasons. And I'm not convinced that we are. So we start in this whole bill, and we talk about where this bill is and what it's all about. And so why would we name a bill an act to prevent unnecessary labor disruptions and protect the economy? Why would we name it that? We've heard from many people, from many areas, that over the last number of years, it's only 3 times we had to see any contract arbitration. So to me, that would mean that things seem to be working. So if things are working, again, I guess it might be a Cape Breton saying, but you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And this isn't broke. It's working. We have some really good relationships between unions and businesses, and it's working. And they sit down and they discuss where they are and how they can get to the next point. We see today we see in NewPage, for example, a business that looks like it's really not going to survive. But there is discussions going on. And guess what's happening? The union that represents the people that are working at NewPage are here in this city, sitting down and talking to the potential buyers and trying to work their way through to make it work. They don't need first contract arbitration. They are sitting down and talking. What's wrong with that picture? From where I sit, there's nothing wrong with that. That's how it survives. That's how this whole thing works, is to make sure that things are in place. Now, the name, it sort of distracts me. You know, an act to prevent unnecessary labor disruptions. But yet when you ask the government to point at all these unnecessary labor disruptions, they have nowhere to point. Protect the economy. Well, you know, that's exactly why we're fighting this bill, is to protect the economy. Instead of seeing the economy shrink, instead of seeing the employer shrink, we want it to be a fair playing field. We want it to be a place where people can come and determine whether they can make a business work. And we've seen the direction that this government has taken us. When it comes to looking at the economy and doing what's right for the economy, one of their very first moves was to take away the subsidy from the ferry in Yarmouth. Now, from what I've been told by the people that I know that live in that area, and by listening to the member from Yarmouth, who's very capable in bringing forward the concerns of that area, as well as the member from Argyll, they're telling us that indeed that had an impact on their economy, and not a positive one. Not a positive one. But that was something that this government trumped out and did in the early days, and they are pounding their chest on what a great thing we've done here. We saved the province $7 million, but we've cost 300 jobs. What effect does that have on that region? What effect does that have on those families? And I would say to you, Madam Speaker, the effect is great, because there was a trickle effect. The same as we talk about the trickle effect with the Irving shipyard. The Irving shipyard is going to build all these ships, and they're going to need subcontractors, and they're going to need subcontractors for the subcontractors, and so on. And that contract is a great thing for this province. A great thing for this province. But it's the same thing. When you have a ferry, it needs services too, so it contracts out and gets fuel supplies and other types of supplies that it needs, and they contract out to other people. So there's the trickle effect there too. The hotels in that area have seen an effect on them. As a matter of fact, Madam Speaker, the hotels in Cape Breton seen an effect of the Yarmouth ferry being closed down. 40% of the bus tours that used to come to Cape Breton Island came across that ferry, and they're not there anymore. And of course, when you listen to our Minister of Tourism, he'll tell you, well, it's the world economy. Well, I know we don't have any control over that, but I do know we had control over the Yarmouth ferry, and we blew that out of the water. So, what else do we have to do to convince this government that waiting for 6 months is not such a bad idea? Well, I guess, you know, we heard from the honourable member from Cape Breton South earlier that he wants to hear from law amendments, and we do too. But there was an open letter, Madam Speaker, that was sent to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. And it was sent on November the 22nd, 2011. And I'm not sure how many members of the government side of the House have had an opportunity to hear this. I'm not sure if all of our members on this side of the House heard it. But, Madam Speaker, I'm going to let them know what it had to say. I'm going to read it to you, and then I'll table it.
You want that, John? You're going to ask for it, Grant.
Madam Speaker, am I correct in that it's you that controls the debate in this House?
The member has the floor. Carry on.
And Madam, I'm not going to read the whole letter. I'm going to leave out the address on it, so it won't be the whole letter. Minister Moore, on behalf of tens of thousands of businesses in Nova Scotia, we write you today to outline our disappointment with your plans to bring first contract arbitration to Nova Scotia. We are disappointed this is being done despite the unanimous opposition of business, large and small, across the province. We view both the legislation and the process that drove it as an anti-business, and as such, urge you to reconsider. Now, Madam Speaker, what I've just read there is basically what I've been talking about the last little while. It's about giving people a fair chance to be heard. People want to be heard. They're telling us that in this letter. We have repeatedly heard, and we have a harmonious labour environment here in Nova Scotia, and are fortunate to experience one of the fewest numbers of lost days due to labour disputes in Canada. Again, a good thing. A good thing here in Canada. And it goes on to say many other things, and then it goes on to say, as we have shared in the past, there are tools already at government's disposal to deal with the rare circumstances where first contracts not be settled. Well, you know, Madam Speaker, again, that's what we on this side of the House have been saying to this House. There are tools already in place. There are measures already in place. There are things already here, and nobody on that side of the House has been able to prove to us as a community that this is good for everybody. And it's amazing how we don't know, we listen, and we get letters from the people that are actually in business and driving the economy of Nova Scotia, who when they write a check, they know what's going to happen with their check and what effect it's going to have, very unsimilar to what sometimes takes place across the floor. But these are the people who we say, let me rephrase that, Madam Speaker. These are the people who the government says they're trying to help. And these are the people that are saying, no thanks, we don't need your help. We don't need it because we got something that's already working. What else does this letter say? We have shared these views in every aspect of the process. In our correspondence with the department, during the study day, in our efforts to reach out to the employer representatives on the Labour Management Review Committee, and to the LMRC itself, to which we presented. Now, that's interesting. They presented to the Labour Management Review Committee. And Madam Speaker, I have a letter from the Labour Management Review Committee, and I'd like to read from that. And it says, well, you know what? I had the question from across the way, we're going to read it all. Well, it's only 2 paragraphs. But I'm sure they can keep their attention span that long to listen to 2 paragraphs. But I'll just read one. I'll just read one because, Madam Speaker, I don't want to take advantage of your great nature. After some very engaging and productive discussion, the Labour Management Review Committee has been unable, I'll repeat that, unable to reach a consensus on whether first contract arbitration should be available under the Nova Scotia Trade Union Act. Now, isn't that interesting? So in one letter, we have the business community telling us, we don't need this, and we made representatives to the people that are supposed to be listening to us. So they said already they can't have it, they don't need it. Then we have from their own committee, from the government's own committee, a letter that says, we can't figure out if we really need this or not. But it appears that that side of the House has made their decision. You've heard from your own committee, you've heard from the business community, but yet you sit there and you say, you gotta have this, this is what's good for you. Well, Madam Speaker, it doesn't appear to be the case. And that's not my words. That's the words of the business community and the committee. And there's that letter. And I'll table that letter. That's the letter from the review committee. But there's still some more interesting things taking place in the letter from the business community. We have acknowledged, the business community says, that most Canadians live in jurisdictions where the FCA exists. This seems to be the sole and constant argument put forth in favor of FCA. On this point, we would like to clarify that while 85% of Canadians live in jurisdictions that have some form of FCA, only 4%, Madam Speaker, have the model of the FCA that is being proposed for Nova Scotia, and that would be the Manitoba model. So here we are. We are talking about a piece of legislation that we're being told is supposed to be good for the province of Nova Scotia, good for the workers in Nova Scotia, good for the businesses in Nova Scotia. Yet we have a letter from the businesses who say, no, this is not good for us. We have a letter from the government's own committee who says, no, this is not, we can't make our mind up if this is what we really need in the province of Nova Scotia in the Trade Union Act. And then we find out that although the argument that the government has been using, about 85% of the provinces in the country using this method, only 4% have the same model that's being proposed for us here in Nova Scotia, in a province that is governed by the same party as governing Nova Scotia. Wonder, that's interesting. Now, all of these businesses, Madam Speaker, I don't think can be wrong, because I'm going to read to you the names of the people that signed this list, and you're going to see that there's some very successful companies there. So they must know what they're doing. They must know how, indeed, to run a business, to keep their employees happy, and to make sure that what's taking place in their workspace is productive. Because, Madam Speaker, as I said earlier, and I'll say again, nobody goes into business to lose money. They can't afford to. They can't survive. They can't keep their doors open. And as I say, I know that there's some small businessmen on that side of the house, and I certainly know there's some on this side of the house who have had businesses in the past. And they've been successful because they kept their employees happy. Now, I just want to give you a hint as to who all these people are. But here's how they close their letter, Madam Speaker. For all of those reasons, we urge you to reconsider and act to prevent unnecessary labor disruptions and protect the economy, and ask that the government instead focus on measures we can work on together to improve labor relations in Nova Scotia while growing the economy. We do not believe the FCA will achieve either of those goals. And it's signed by the Atlantic Building Supply Dealers Association, the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, Canadian Restaurant and Food Services Association, the Construction Association of Nova Scotia, Canadian Taxpayers Association, the Halifax Chamber of Commerce, the Hotel Association of Nova Scotia, Merit Contractors Association of Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia Automobile Dealers Association, the Nova Scotia Chambers of Commerce, the Nova Scotia Home Builders Association, the Nova Scotia Road Builders Association, the Restaurant Association of Nova Scotia, the Retail Council of Canada, the Atlantic Office, the Sackville Business Association, the Scotia Group of Companies, Tourism Industry Association of Nova Scotia, and the Truro and District Chamber of Commerce. Well, Madam Speaker, that's quite an impressive list. And I would guess that between them, they employ a significant number of people. A lot of Nova Scotians who rely on small business to survive. A lot of small communities and small municipalities and villages. And it's a small business that enables them to do things like have parks and do fundraisers. I mean, when you go to small business, well, Madam Speaker, and I've had the opportunity to do a number of auctions for people who are trying to get a treatment for MS. And every time you go to one of those auctions, small business after small business after small business donates. They take out of their profit margin and give back to the communities so they can help the people that they support. And we've seen in Sydney, and I'm sure in other areas, when there's campaigns to raise funds for cancer units, who's leading the parade to make that happen? The small business community of this province. So when we ask that they have an opportunity to be heard, when we ask that the time is taken to make sure that everyone is heard, I don't think that's an unfair request. And I think that's one of the strongest reasons, and one of the things that I and the member from Cape Breton South may differ on, is that we need time to make sure everybody is heard. Because unfortunately, Madam Speaker, not everybody can travel to Halifax. If you're a small business owner in Yarmouth or Amherst or Glace Bay, and you're the key person, you're probably the one that opens the door in the morning, as I said earlier. You're probably the one that makes the dash to the bank to do the deposit. You're the one that does the ordering, and you're the one that makes sure the doors are locked at night. In order for you to make sure that you're able to come and make a presentation, you need time so you can plan those other activities for other people to do for you. And that's what this will allow to happen. It'll allow the opportunity for people to come here and make a presentation. Now, some are saying that this is a useless cause for us to stand here and talk because there is a majority government. Well, you know what, Madam Speaker? When I was home on the weekend, as I said earlier, I had people say, make sure you don't vote for that bill. That bill's not good for me. It's not good for my business. What about the small business? You have people working in it who have never done anything else in their lives. They've worked in this small business, whether it be a small construction business or a logging company, and their skill sets are the highest quality in that area. But if that small business closes, how easy is it for them to find a new place to work? We have to be sure, Madam Speaker, that we're giving every Nova Scotian an opportunity. That's our obligation. That's part of what we are here to do as MLAs, is to give people as much an opportunity as possible. You know, when I think about how we don't hear from the backbench, from the government backbench, about what's going on in their communities, it reminds me of the time when I was a shepherd. One time, Madam Speaker, I looked after 1,500 sheep. There were 1,500 sheep. And the one thing that I could tell you, Madam Speaker, is this, that if you got one sheep that found its way through the fence, the rest of them would follow. And it appears we have a bunch of sheep on the other side, and someone led them to the trough and said, this is good for you. And the others just followed through the trough, and they're going there like a herd of sheep, going away from what the constituents have asked them to do, and put them in a place where they're doing what they're told to do. And that's not what this House is supposed to be about, Madam Speaker. Now, we've seen jobs declining in this province. And you know what? That might happen regardless of who's in government. It is how that government reacts that makes the difference. And if you keep burying your head in the sand and saying there's not a problem, then indeed there is an issue. We've seen things about job decline. We've had questions in this House yesterday and today about the job numbers in this province and how they've declined, and there's not as many jobs. Using the numbers that were supplied from the Department of Finance, who I understand gets their numbers from Stats Canada. And yet, when they're asked the questions in the House, the government says, well, it's simply not so. That's simply not so. Well, tell that to the guy in Yarmouth that's not working on the ferry anymore. Tell that to the guy at New Page, or the gal, who's not able to have a job in the paper mills anymore. Tell that to the person who works in the hotels and there's no jobs. If it's not so, why is it that there are so many people unemployed? New Page, Madam Speaker, is fighting for its survival. And we've seen in this House people who worked at New Page who were up in the gallery, pensioners who were concerned about what was going to happen to them because they worked for years for these companies in good faith, delivering what was promised. And now, to no fault of their own, their jobs are in jeopardy. We need in this province a made in Nova Scotia energy solution so we can help address some of these problems that these communities are facing. And all I hear sometimes from our Minister of Energy, who, by the way, I respect, but he says, well, you know, coal is dirty. We shouldn't be using coal. And you know what? There are chances. There's problems. There's new technology coming out all the time, but we need to go to green energy, and our party is in favor of going to green energy. But his own department, Madam Speaker, his own department will tell you that this province will be reliant on coal for the next 10 to 20 years, regardless of how much green energy we put in place. They will tell you that. His department tells you that. It's not me, his department. The Nova Scotia Power will tell you that. Now, we have resources in this province, like coal in the mine in Donkin, that if we developed that, we'd be putting Nova Scotians to work, supplying coal for Nova Scotians, paying taxes in Nova Scotia, and helping to stabilize power rates because you would be dealing in the same denomination of dollars. Instead, they opt to bring in the shore from the offshore, the coal from the offshore. Now, Madam Speaker, the government says, well, that's not our decision. Well, I believe if they look that there are some things they can do. And if you are using a resource from Nova Scotia, and if you are putting that to the benefit of all Nova Scotians, wouldn't that, Madam Speaker, make sense to you? Because it certainly makes sense to me. And what would it do for a small community like Donkin? Well, one of the things it would do is it would help support a lot of these small businesses we're talking about. It would also help to keep people from traveling out west to find work, which means it would help the family units and it would help the children of our communities. Now, Madam Speaker, that's only one example of how we could do something proactive, put Nova Scotians to work, ask them to pay taxes, and at the same time, secure a constant Nova Scotia supply for Nova Scotia Power. Because I can tell you, Madam Speaker, some of those people that live in this province who say, we need all green energy, and I have no problem with green energy. I want to make that very clear. I have no problem with green energy. But the minister's numbers say that you're going to be reliant on coal for some time to come. So we should be using Nova Scotian coals. We should be putting Nova Scotians to work, and we should be doing it in a way that we're all proud and taking and helping to solve a problem that is indeed major in this province. Because we've seen two major employers tell us that one of the reasons that the jobs that they provide are in jeopardy is because of power rates. So here's something that we could do as a province to help make sure that that comes back. Now, Madam Speaker, you're giving me that look as if I'm roaming a little bit. But you know what? You know what, Madam Speaker? It is, it's not about roaming. It's about trying to be practical and helping to share ideas. Because that's what we should be doing in this House, Madam Speaker. We should be sharing ideas of how we can make this province better for everybody to live, regardless of what party we sit in. It's about making sure that indeed we are proud Nova Scotians, first and foremost. And that's why I talk about those kind of things. But let's get back to some other things. Let's ask about, we have 3 government members from the county of Pictou. Pictou East, Pictou West, and Pictou Centre. 2 of them sitting in the cabinet, Madam Speaker. In Pictou County. In Pictou County. In Pictou County, we have one of the largest employers. We have one of the largest employers there in Sobeys. They provide a tremendous number of jobs in this province through their different holdings, not just their grocery stores, but all the other things they do. Now the question is, have these members who represent those areas sat down and talked with anybody from Sobeys? And I see the Minister of Energy over there shaking his head yes. Now I guess when I ask him this question, he's going to shake his head as well. When you were there, did the Sobeys say we need first contract arbitration? That would be the question I would like to see. Now I don't see anything shaking. Oh no, his boots are shaking. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, because he doesn't know how to answer that, because other members of cabinet are looking at him. But I'll tell you what the people of Pictou County will say. We don't need this. We don't need this. We have people here who are providing good jobs for us. Why would you put it in jeopardy? The member from Pictou East won't even pick his eyes up to look over to see what's going on now. Because I'm sure that he met with the Pew. And I'm sure that the member from Pictou East, who is a progressive socialist in his own words, and who was always talking about my Lewisburg, Mr. Speaker, has he sat down? Has he sat down and talked with the people there? Not only the people that own the company, but the people they work for. The people that work in the company, have they sat down and talked to you and said, oh, you got to get this done. And you got to get it done right now because it's going to make a big difference in my life. I'll even have Christmas now because you got this done so quick. Mr. Speaker.
That's the Minister of Finance saying that.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is this hoist will allow the opportunity for more people to have a chance to have their input. As I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, if the bill is good now, it'll be good in 6 months' time. So in my way of thinking, my simple Cape Breton way, is if something is that good, we can wait. We can wait, and we can see what everybody has to say. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is nobody in this House that cares more about his constituents than you do. And we know that. We know that all members of this House care about their constituents. But we all have an obligation. Doesn't matter what party we sit in. And I've seen it before in this House, Mr. Speaker, where members of the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party and the NDP Party have worked together on things that were good. And I can draw from my own experience of being from Cape Breton Island. And when there's something good for Cape Breton Island, the Liberals and the NDP and the Conservatives, we work together. We work to make sure that that's what's good for the area. Because that's our first goal. Our first goal is to do what's good for the area, do what's good for the province. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we need to do what's right for this province. We need to make sure that the people of this House do the right thing. And I guess, Mr. Speaker, and I said this before, but I'll go back to it again. That's why I'm having trouble understanding why we can't put a commission together and send it around the province. The same thing we've got going here now with the Electoral Commission. They're going around, and the member from Argyll is here, and so far he's been in Truro, and he's been in Port Hawkesbury, and he's been listening to people, and there's 5 members from the government there, and there's 2 members from the Liberal Party, and there's 2 members from our party, and they've been listening to what people have to say. Why do they go around? Why do they go around to the different areas? Well, it's pretty simple. They go around to the different areas because not everyone can come to Halifax. But it's also because they want to make sure that they had a good hearing, that they had the opportunity to listen to enough people. It's called democracy, where we are the home of democracy. So, you know, when you look at democracy as we know it in the Commonwealth, this House is the second place after Westminster where it's taken place. That's not something we should take lightly. That's something that we should all be very proud of. That's something that we should be talking about right now. This bill, after listening to labor, listening to business, listening to the communities around, it's saying, we're not sure why you're doing this. We're not sure why you're putting this in place. Now, Mr. Speaker, I talked, I guess, but I talked about the Sobeys in Pictou County and what's going on there. But, you know, when I look across, there are some members there that have some severe employment problems and issues and challenges going on in their community. Like the member from Queens, there's some issues going on there, and I know that she's working hard to try to address those issues. Oh, and I have no question in my mind that she's sincere about doing everything she can, Mr. Speaker, to make that better. So there sort of lies my problem. On one case, when we see a business in trouble, we know that the members work hard to make it happen. But then we see a piece of legislation that the businesses say shouldn't be put in place, and they gave a bunch of reasons in the letter that I tabled earlier. I wonder why the difference, why the change, why it's not working. But we have another big employer in this province, Mr. Speaker, and that employer is Michelin. And Michelin have 3 plants in the province of Nova Scotia. And most people already know about them. I don't have to tell them about them. And I bet you there's not a person in this room that doesn't have somebody that works at Michelin in some way, shape, or form. And those people have good jobs. The product they produce is known world-renowned. They live in our communities. They're people that we represent. They are people who have given us our jobs. And we're saying, well, you know, I got to ask the question, is this bill about getting to Michelin? Is this bill about seeing Michelin become unionized? Now I see the Minister of Heritage Culture over there shaking his head no. And you know what? I hope he's right. I hope he's right. But he's a member of the same government that said, we're not going to raise taxes by 2%. He's a member of the government that said, we're going to fix the ERs and they'll be open 24 hours. He is the fellow that said, one of them, who said, he's one of the ones of that government who said they would balance the budget in the first year. And none of those things have come true. Now, Mr. Speaker, the minister's not over there shaking his head anymore, he's shaking his finger. Fortunately, it's a good finger. And he's trying to point something out. And the minister is one of those people who'll come to you and he'll speak to you and he'll explain what's going on. And again, there's nobody on that side of the House, Mr. Speaker, who is in government that we dislike, or at least I dislike. We have a difference of opinions. No. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'll clarify that. There's nobody in the House tonight. But very sincerely, we're all here trying to do the same job. And we may not agree on the path that we take to do that job, but we all are doing it. The only thing I'm asking here tonight of all of us is to make sure we do the right thing for the rest of the people that aren't in this House. And that is to make sure that they get a fair hearing. That is to make sure that the request that we had from that list of businesses is listened to. That is to make sure that what its own committee has said is listened to. When there is that much doubt, Mr. Speaker, when there is that much doubt, would it not be better, would it not be the right thing to take this bill and leave it for 6 months so more research can be done, so more evidence can be found, pro or con, so that indeed anyone in the province of Nova Scotia who wanted to make a representation had that opportunity to make the representation, so that then one of two things would happen. The government would decide that they're going to go ahead with this legislation because it's been proven to them that it's the right way to go, or this legislation won't move forward because they've listened to the constituents that they've been asked to represent. They've listened to the people of the province of Nova Scotia, and they've heard that we do not need this at a time when our economy and our job situation is so fragile. Mr. Speaker, this is not an issue that can be addressed by saying it's simply not so. This is an issue that needs to get a true hearing, a real hearing from all the people in the province of Nova Scotia, and this government has the opportunity to do the right thing. And Mr. Speaker, I would encourage the members on that side of the House who are on the back benches to really talk to the businesses when they go home this weekend, to listen to the people that sent them here, and take that message back to the front benches and say to them what they've heard. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I did last session, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise on what is seems to be a very contentious issue before the House, as I did on Bill 100. I'm pleased to support the hoisted movement, and my colleague from Cape Breton had quite an effort to point out why we're going through this process when we're faced with a majority government. I'd like to think that it's called political strategy, Mr. Speaker. Back late summer, early September, a lot of my constituents were asking me, when are you going back into the House? When is the House going to resume so we can get some things done in this province? Well, Mr. Speaker, when I explained to them that the reason we go back in late is because we're either waiting for something good to happen or something bad has taken place. And when we look at the time when government came in to sit, October 31st, it was also mentioned that it's so government can say that they sat for a number of months. The one thing that holds true in political moves, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that this is the time of year when most people aren't paying attention to politics. However, it's also a time when government can slip something in as contentious as Bill 102, and therefore the reason why I support the hoisted motion by the Conservative Party to allow these business owners who have obviously, in the last number of weeks since this has been announced, are paying attention. Mr. Speaker, if we don't allow these individuals the time to make their way here to the Province House, as I said about Bill 100, as I stated around the fair drug pricing bill, I believe that this is a move that this government will regret, and the people of this province and businesses in this province will regret for many years. And I know that back in 2009, in an NDP campaign that focused on coming to power There was an issue of where do we get the seats from, Mr. Speaker, and those seats simply have to come from rural Nova Scotia. It's widely known that the NDP held a number of seats here in the metro region, and for years they could not break into the rural seats. Well, you know, to their credit, they made that effort, and the orange tide swept over Nova Scotia, and they now have a majority government, and a large part to the success of the candidates that ran in rural Nova Scotia. Now, saying that, Mr. Speaker, and hearing some of the numbers and the stats that we've heard from this side of the House over the last number of weeks around job losses, lack of job creation, it's troubling. To hear today from the member from Inverness about the out-migration, some of the largest numbers this province has seen in history, is concerning, Mr. Speaker. And those residents in rural Nova Scotia would probably right now, after 2 years of an NDP government mandate, be sitting back saying, well, perhaps we should take a sober second thought. And of course they will when the next election is called. Mr. Speaker, Bill 102 has been said by a number of members in their debate that it's payback. It's payback to the big unions. Bill 100 would have set that trend. Probably the only contentious bill in the previous session, other than the fair drug pricing bill, when we've seen 50-plus pharmacists, independent pharmacies, show up here to the House for law amendments to stress the importance of fair negotiations with the government and the Department of Health. So we know they're out there paying attention. And by hoisting this, yeah, we're going through the motions. It's a political move on the opposition's part, but we have to ask ourselves why. And it's simply to give them time, because as my colleague from Cape Breton had just made mention, they're small business owners, a lot of them. And it takes time to put things in place, put employees in place, and to make the travel and the trip to Halifax. So that's what I guess we're hoping tonight sends out to them, that we're listening. And Mr. Speaker, recently, as of yesterday, I received an email from A&M Fabrications and up in Oxford. And I'm sure many of us got that very same email. And there's some concerns. The other night there was an event that unfortunately was canceled, and it was Canadian manufacturers had an event at the World Trade and Convention Center. And they wanted to meet their MLAs. And I have to admit, Mr. Speaker, when I first got the invitation, I didn't respond in a timely fashion. And then another email attempt came by that organization. And again, I did not respond. Well, the other day when I was in my office in the afternoon, I got a phone call from that organization stressing the importance of having me come to that event. Today, I guess, with Bill 102 on the floor, it could lead one to think that they needed to bend our ears on this very issue. Now, the government simply sits back and says, now Bill 102 is accepted in 85% of all jurisdictions across Canada. Absolutely. So why not here? Well, if you look at some of the stats and figures, Mr. Speaker, over the years, when it comes to labor negotiations and disputes, what's the reason? And we've heard it time and time again. This is my opportunity to recite it. 97% of the bargaining in the province does reach agreement during conciliation, Mr. Speaker. And over the last 14 years, Labour boards only had to step in 3 times. That's a pretty good track record. And I think it's easy to say that it's probably one of the best in Canada. So the question is why? Why? Because we have a majority government. Why? Because it's obvious. The public know that the NDP have always had a large following with the Labour movement. We also know that there are Labour leaders who sit on the Economic Council of the Premier. With Bill 100, we saw the creation of the review board that, interestingly enough, as it's been mentioned a number of times, could not come to a general consensus on this very issue. And that board is made up of organizations that don't allow a non-union member to sit on it. Mr. Speaker, recently there was a dinner, the Premier held a dinner. It was a $175 plate dinner, and it allowed any Nova Scotians that wanted to partake in that dinner to hear about his vision for the province. I didn't attend, to no surprise, Mr. Speaker, because the vision that I had, that I accepted, was the one that he had laid out for the people of this province in 2009. And we know what happened then with that vision. With the very campaign that the Premier took around the province about balancing the budget, about not raising taxes, and decreasing the deficit, the job creation, addressing rural Nova Scotia and out-migration. A lot of things have changed. To the credit of the Premier, and we've heard many times during question period, he has taken the HST off of electricity. And we commend him for that. But that was 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker. And with the demand-side management program, we've seen the tax go right back on. And many seniors, when they got their bills, when that tax went on, immediately started calling the offices saying, where did this come from? Well, we know the environment's important. And unfortunately, low-income Nova Scotians have to suffer. And there's nothing that government can do to fix that, or have done. When we talk about the economics, and I mean, we've had some of the worst GDP growth in all of Canada. And we've heard from organizations like CFIB, 5,200 members. We've heard recently, over the last week, from 33 chambers of commerce that represent around 7,000 businesses, about their dismay as to the timing of this. And you know what? Perception's tough. And you cannot get away from it, Mr. Speaker. You cannot get away with the fact that we don't have any labor issues. Well, we had a strike last session. I do remember that. It was a 4-day strike with the Housing Authority. And I couldn't quite figure that one out, but we remedied it. And we have another pending strike with a small local, a Local 26, which I raised a question on. But I'm sure that this government and the minister is going to make the efforts to appease those members and give them the credit that they deserve. So I don't see anything long-standing there. But Mr. Speaker, when you look at the people, the businesses and the organizations that are coming to the members on this side of the House, and I know they're also going to the government members, because as I said, many of them live and represent rural Nova Scotia. They have legitimate concerns with the amount of job losses. When we look at the Bowwaters and the New Pages and the Fundy Gypsons, the folks that are suffering down in Yarmouth, Colchester County, Spring Hill. Today we heard from the member from Cumberland South about the manufacturers in the Spring Hill area that are going to struggle if the unions have this one final piece that they need. And Mr. Speaker, I guess that's the whole premise of this. Is this the Premier's vision for the next number of years? And if it is, despite the fact that they don't see it, maybe I think they see it. There's some very intelligent people on that side of the House. They just don't want to believe it. Or they've drank the Kool-Aid and it hasn't quite turned to the poison yet. Because businesses will withdraw. Entrepreneurs will not begin to start business. We need a competitive business environment, Mr. Speaker, and Bill 102 definitely doesn't assist it. When you look at the title of the bill, and this has also been mentioned, but it's worth at this point in the day to continue on with it, an act to prevent unnecessary labor disruptions. Have there been any? I think if you look at the track record of this government and the last 2 years that they've carried out their mandate, a number of unions went to their final hours in negotiations, but somehow, even after the Deputy Premier voiced his opinions to the media about this 1%, we're only going to throw this 1% out, and he was quickly caught by the Premier and reined in for that comment, we still had some of those large unions get exactly what they wanted in the final hours. So no labor disruption. But here we have the one final cog that the unions need. Mr. Speaker, in 2009, in the campaign of 2009, and I wish I had it here in my hands right now, but I believe there was a briefing note sent out by the NDP. Because in my riding of Dartmouth North, Mr. Speaker, I have a large industrial park, largest one east of Montreal that I represent, and quite a number of people that are, you know, in the business world that live in my community that expressed to me at the time, about midway through that campaign, because they seen that tide switching, and they seen that Nova Scotians for the first time were going to give the NDP a chance. And what came out on the doorsteps, interestingly enough, Mr. Speaker, was the fact that I was being questioned on whether the then leader of the opposition, who would obviously become premier, would he tamper with the Michelin bill? Now that's kind of not, we're not tampering, that bill's not on the floor, but this definitely allows the labor movement to have that final piece. Mr. Speaker, we've seen 6,600 jobs lost in rural Nova Scotia over the last year. That's a hard pill to swallow. And what we have is we had the minister and the premier announce a new strategy, as they did last session with Jobs Here, and now we have a workplace strategy. And yet the minister stands up and he says he has no exact targets, and that targets aren't good to have because they allow governments to have a ceiling on jobs. And it's kind of interesting, because I know when a lot of these business owners that are contacting us now go into the credit unions and the banks for loans, they have to have a business plan, Mr. Speaker, and that business plan calls for targets. So to hear the minister say that, kind of question whether or not we should be worried about the economics of this province in that minister's hands. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia is one of the only provinces that don't index personal income tax brackets. They have the highest sales tax, the highest corporate tax, the second highest workers' compensation premiums in Canada. And we've heard many members on this side of the House talk about the high power rates. And what do we hear from the Premier and this government? We hear that for the first time in 20 years, they've lowered the small business tax, and to their credit, they have. And I believe one of the backbenchers said the other day we've lowered it twice, and that's correct. But Mr. Speaker, when you own a business and operate a business, there's many components to which lead you to success and to profit, and that the business tax is just one piece. You have to be able to make payroll. You have to be able to pay all your overhead, your salaries, your power bills, your suppliers. And if we give the labor movement this one piece that's being orchestrated through Bill 102, we are opening up ourselves to a movement that I don't think our province can take right now. It's not the time. We are on shaky ground. The numbers state it. But here we are in the middle of November, and we've gone through 2.5 weeks, but no one's really paying attention. But they will now, Mr. Speaker. They will now. And hopefully, like the member from Cape Breton South had stated earlier, quite poignantly, this is their time now. Because we're 52. We have the opportunity, and this government was given a 4-year mandate of uninterrupted business to do what's right for the people of this province. And to do this now, to bring this bill in now, the timing of it is just, there's something interesting about that, Mr. Speaker, and maybe it's payback. And if it is, I wonder if the Premier spoke about that in his speech the other night when he had his dinner and he was talking about the vision that he has for this province. Are we going to rely on the Irving shipbuilding contract, Mr. Speaker, which we really won't start reaping the fruits of that till 2013? Are we going to rely on that? That's the silver bullet that's going to carry this province? Not quite sure, Mr. Speaker. There'll definitely be an influx, and we appreciate that federal contract. but we can't rely on one magic bullet. But when you're talking about places like Michelin, 3,500 jobs, boy, wouldn't that be a blow? You lose Bowater, you have Michelin potentially unionized. And I remember, Mr. Speaker, in 2007, I had an opportunity to go to Paris. And I went to Paris with the member of Cape Breton South, and we were there for an international composite material expo, Mr. Speaker, and there was a gentleman there that has been sought after and recognized internationally and awarded internationally for his efforts, and that gentleman's name was Mr. Maurice Guitin. And I know Maurice, you know, he's a great spokesman for Nova Scotia, and I remember him saying, you know, he loved having those little pins that we wear on our lapels, and everywhere he goes, he takes those Nova Scotia pins because he's proud of having the opportunity to build Composites Atlantic up to the point where they are. And Mr. Speaker, he built that company up to over 300 jobs, 300 non-unionized jobs. And I remember on that trip, you know, we had some time to talk to Maurice, and I asked him, I said, you know, how, and he knew at that time I was a New Democrat. And he knew, and he figured that, he didn't know much about my background, but he figured I was in support of big labor. But he still wanted to have a conversation with me and to see, just to kind of gauge where I'm coming from, what my politics really are beyond the party lines. And I remember asking Maurice at that time, you know, have the unions gone into Composite Atlantic? Have they tried to unionize those 300 plus members? Well, Mr. Speaker, I remember Maurice saying quite simply, oh, they've tried 3 or 4 times. And his employees, the employees there at Composites Atlantic in Lunenburg, simply said, you know what, we're okay. We have fair wages, we have a great drug plan, and we have somebody who treats us like family. Quite simply put, they didn't need big union to come in to represent them. And what did we see this past fall, Mr. Speaker? 37 jobs lost, I believe, rural Nova Scotia. And Maurice just recently received a big award again, an acknowledgement, even though he's retired. But I'll never forget what he said there. And I come from a family, my father was in the International Steelworkers Union. So I have that background. But to hear a business owner stress the importance of treating their employees fairly, but also being able to grow his business without the threat of the big unions coming in. That was something that stuck with me, and that was back in 2007. And here we are, Mr. Speaker, several years later under an NDP watch, when in 2009 there was a clear message that the now Premier would not tamper with the Michelin bill. And this isn't, again, this is not the Michelin bill we're talking about, but this is the one piece that's missing. And I have to wonder, Mr. Speaker, you know, I had a thought today, and I know I mentioned it to one of the members on the other side. You know, we have, there's a discussion today around the members in Pictou County, and obviously represented by 3 NDP members. And I asked the question of one of those members around the former Trenton Works. And I know Trenton Works was unionized at one point, and I know that we've funneled in several millions of dollars into, with a foreign company to go in there and build wind turbines. So some of those folks are back to work, and that's a good thing, Mr. Speaker, for that particular area. But I asked them, do they go back in and have union certification automatically? And he couldn't answer that, but I come to think that, you know, what if all those workers got back there and a union came in? If it's not unionized, and I'm saying that because I don't really know, but I was given the impression that there's no union there now. What if a union went in there? Would that foreign company want to stay? Not sure. Another area, Mr. Speaker, I have a large call center that I represent in Highfield Park, Convergys. And I know over the years, there was a lot of criticism by the member from Halifax-Chebucto around NSBI's willingness to give payroll rebates to those contact centers or call centers. And businesses that come in and set up and with no clear targets or initiatives or guarantees that they're going to stay here for any period of time. The member from Cape Breton South brought this up the other day, and I started thinking about Convergys and the amount of jobs, the hundreds of jobs that are in Highfield Park right now, and the very thought that Bill 102 would have on that particular company. Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what it would have. It would have a resounding negative effect, not only on the employees, the business owners, but, Mr. Speaker, on the taxpayers of this province, because of the amounts of monies that former governments and this current government gives as incentives for those companies to come here and set up. And you think about all the contact centers that are around this province. What if there was the ability to unionize? Would they want to come here? Chances are, Mr. Speaker, they wouldn't want to come here. They won't come here. The other resounding effect, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, would be a lot of them would probably pull out and go to markets like the US or markets like India. We had a government that campaigned, a government now that campaigned on change, Mr. Speaker. This isn't change. This has given us exactly what the Labour movement had wanted, what Nova Scotians pretty much read into what they would get with an NDP government. Favors for the union. Well, I don't want to call it favors for the union, but it's a slippery slope and a bad trend and a bad message for this Premier and this government to send to the business community. A Premier who knew back in 2009 that he had to somehow break ground with his NDP members into the business community. And this is the wrong message to send, Mr. Speaker, as was Bill 100. And I stated back in the last session that Bill 100 sent a bad message. That on one hand, the Premier's saying he wants to acknowledge the business community, but on the other hand, he's slapping them. Mr. Speaker, we're talking about employers in rural Nova Scotia. Michelin, Composites Atlantic, Oxford Frozen Foods, Sobeys. Now, Mr. Speaker, we all know the success of Sobeys in this province and around Canada. We know how many people that they employ. We also know that, as been mentioned during this session of the House, the amount of high taxes that we pay in this province, arguments about motor fuel tax, heating costs going up. Something else, Mr. Speaker, that's gone up in this province has been food costs. And one would have to think that if Bill 102 goes through and an entity as large as Sobeys is telling us, whoa, put the brakes on, well, I'm going to think back that, well, maybe if Bill 102 gets put in place with this majority government because they can, Sobeys is going to have to find a way if wages are going to be demanded to be increased and unions go in there and run roughshod. Well, I would have to think, Mr. Speaker, food costs are going to go up even more. And that, I can tell you right now, in tough economic times, with the amount of job losses that this province has seen in the last 2 years, that's going to be devastating for the people of this province, Mr. Speaker. Because many of us MLAs know that the route to the food bank is a tough one to haul. And there's not much, as the member from Cape Breton Centre, I believe, would know. He had struggled with his food bank recently in New Waterford. So I fear for people like Sobeys, good corporate citizens, give back to community and always have, want to continue to grow as they have in this province. Bill 102 would stymie that, Mr. Speaker. In that trip to Paris in 2007, there was a member from Economic Development that had been with the government for quite a long time, Mr. Marvin Robar. And I remember talking with Marvin and asking him, you know, why we don't have more manufacturing set up in Nova Scotia. And why we don't have more companies coming here. And he said, well, we don't promote ourselves enough. We don't go out and approach companies, as was mentioned earlier in the week about former Premier Frank McKenna. We don't go out as much and invite companies to come here. And Mr. Speaker, when you think about this is, whose tool is this? Is this the union's tool, or is this the government's way of inviting business to this province? And again, you know, as legislators, we have the right and the opportunity and the privilege to bring in and promote and change existing and new legislation. And we all take great pride in that. But Mr. Speaker, Bill 102 and the premise of it, when we're looking at business growth in this province, this is devastating. And this is not the path. This cannot, I can't believe that this is the path that the current Premier wants to set this province on. Because sadly, if proclaimed and put in place, and we begin to see the trends, and the job losses continue, and companies decide not to show up and start up, and companies begin to leave like McKesson, which was mentioned the other day by the member from Cumberland South. If that is the path that this Premier and the vision that this Premier has for us, it's not good times now, Mr. Speaker. It won't be good times in the future, and it's going to take another government to change that. So I guess in hoisting this and allowing those large entities and businesses and those small mom and pop, the 5,200 that make up CFIB members, the opportunity to come here and impress upon this NDP government, this majority NDP government, that they are concerned about the future of this province. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, that was part of the change that they voted for. In 2009, for the first time ever, I remember campaigning and going after the Conservative vote immediately. And they came out. And on those doorsteps, Mr. Speaker, they said to me, you know what? I voted 50 years for Conservative, but I'm going to give you guys a chance. Don't know how you're going to balance the budget. Don't raise taxes. And where are we at now, Mr. Speaker? 2 years in, 6,600 job losses in rural Nova Scotia over the last year. Difficult number to swallow. And Mr. Speaker, with Bill 102, I think we have the unfortunate situation where there's no doubt we're going to see more. Is that the legacy that this government wants? That a first-time NDP government wants? That the Premier wants? And I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, toting the Irving shipbuilding contract over and over is only going to get us so far. Because I remember questioning the Premier in the spring of 2010 in the budget. You know, the disappointment in Yarmouth, the high unemployment rate in Cape Breton, Cumberland County, Colchester, the Amherst border. I remember asking the Premier a very simple question. How are you going, so early in your mandate, the province is in such disaccord and disarray, and people are unhappy. How are you going to bring that all together? And he went on for, a good number of minutes explaining how he was going to do that. And 2 years later, almost 2 years later, Mr. Speaker, we're still falling apart. And I know it sounds like doom and gloom, but there's a way out. There is a way out. It's not with Bill 102. Not with Bill 102. The unions do not need this tool. They don't need this tool. 3 times in 10 years, absolutely. Labor Board's been called in 3 times. If we go to strike next week with Local 26, I think we're going to solve that. And hopefully it won't get to the point where they are on the picket line. If rumblings at small manufacturers in Colchester County start to happen, if places like, you know what, and I know the Premier said Michelin hasn't said anything to them. No, they're waiting. They're waiting. I guarantee it, Mr. Speaker. The first time this Bill 102 gets proclaimed, the unions will be knocking. And we don't want to, why in such a contentious time do we want to aggravate the business community now? Why? When the review panel made up of union members and representatives still couldn't come to consensus on this. But a majority government and the minister seen fit to bring this forward in a piece of legislation. So I guess it was kind of, the writing was on the wall, or the document was already planned, and they just needed to put it in place. Either way. And we've heard earlier in the week about YouTube videos and union members, certain union members, and citing that this was a gift, this was payback. This model is one of the most regressive forms of first contract, Mr. Speaker, in all of Canada. And with, I believe it was a 1.9 GDP growth, worst of any province in Canada, and now we're going to do this? And this government actually thinks that bringing the hosts in this late in the year and this being the one piece of legislation that is actually contentious, that no one will pay attention. The backroom politics and political strategists might be relying on the fact that, yes, they do have a majority, but they also have a responsibility, Mr. Speaker, to all Nova Scotians. Not at this time. We can't afford it, Mr. Speaker. Quite simply put, too many people are struggling. And when we have a government that continuously stands in their place and talks about adhering to and acknowledging the collective bargaining agreements and opportunities that unions and members have to go through that process, and not wanting to step in, Bill 102 pops up and doesn't even give those business owners, won't even give those business owners enough time or even the opportunity to engage in conversation with potential disgruntled members and employees. Is that fair? I don't think so. And many of the businesses that we've been approached by and will continue to be approached by in the coming days and weeks don't believe so either. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to, as the member from Cape Breton South had stated earlier, encourage those small business owners and the large business entities come to the Province House. And you know what? Even with the majority, I'll say this. If they choose not to listen, and this is really the path that the Premier wants to go down, wow, what a legacy. But there's a number of them that will retire next time or be voted out, and we'll be right back in the same position as Nova Scotia. What's our vision? And maybe I should have paid the $175 the other night, and I would have heard what his vision is. I thought I had it in 2009, but I guess it's changed, Mr. Speaker. And I hope that both employer and employee and rural Nova Scotia does not take another hit, but I believe they will with 102. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to stand this evening to speak to this bill, this hoist motion that is before us. Before I get into the meat of my my speech, I got a couple of quick comments that I want to make first. One, I want to thank the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal for the roads being nice and clear for my trip back from Port Hawkesbury. I know he didn't hear that yesterday, but I just want to say the roads were in excellent condition in the morning. And I do want to thank, of course, the drivers. I know it was a busy day yesterday, and I just want to put that on the record. I do want to say that I did have the opportunity to be in Truro Bible Hill a couple of days ago. I had the opportunity to chat with that MLA, of course, on her birthday, and I didn't have the chance to wish her that happy birthday in this house. So again, it's a happy birthday to her. But I did have the opportunity to buy her CD and listen to it on my travels across the province. And I do want to thank her for spending some time with me in my car. And I thought she did a darn good job of that CD. It was great to have her along for the ride. Now, after I have those all lined up, I want to talk to this. I was nice. Isn't that a nice way to start? I know that. There you go. All right. Well, I'm going to stick to what I've got here because I think it's important. I also want to thank quickly the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture. I had an opportunity to stop in on them this afternoon, and it was interesting that, you know, celebrating their 116th year of incorporation, I guess is what you would call it, and getting together to be there for farmers in Nova Scotia. And there was a number of issues there that I thought were extremely important to all Nova Scotians, and I wish we were here talking about agriculture in this province or talking about fisheries. That's what I think we should hear from this government, is how they're going to be working with them, protecting them, trying to find ways to make them more economical and making them not just survive but thrive in today's marketplace. So, Mr. Speaker, we get back down to the issue of today, which is, of course, the bill and the hoist that's before us. It's funny, I already did have the opportunity to speak to this once already, and I think it's important, and I thought, you know, what a great opportunity to send this off for a hoist, to say, listen, we feel that the people that have been chatting with us are not accepting what they see in this bill, that they want more time to consult. And what a better way than saying we were going to push this off for a 6-month period so that more consultation can happen. So good legislation isn't rushed. Good legislation takes time to develop. Good legislation requires proper consultation with relevant stakeholders and important groups. And I got to say that what we see before us is not good legislation. What this government has done is try to ram through this legislation without doing their homework and taking the time to get it right for Nova Scotians. It's not a huge surprise. We saw it in Bill 100. We've seen it in a couple other bills that necessarily are not giving the true sounding board, that are not necessarily given the true consideration that they need to be given by Nova Scotians. When dealing with legislation such as this, it is important that proper consultations occur, that government reaches out to both labor organizations and job creators, the employers we have here in Nova Scotia. From the submissions released by the Department of Labor and Advanced Education, it is clear there's a very strong divide between the employers of this province, the entrepreneurs who create jobs for people of our province, and the risk takers and the union groups. Every letter from business groups were set against this legislation. Every letter from union representatives were for this legislation. Each side representing thousands of people in this province. The considerable divide shows there is nowhere near a consensus, Mr. Speaker. There is nowhere near enough consultation done to consider this legislation at all. The consultation has occurred here in regards to this legislation. This is not real consultation, Mr. Speaker. We want consultation to happen with those employers, those job creators across this province. Now, I know the minister talks about the study day. We know that study day was thrown together at the last minute. I think when the government realized that they might have some tough going on it. So many groups, unions, and business not only received a couple of days' notice, but really unable to attend or send representation because of the sort of haphazard method that was put together. And we have talked about this one before, where the member for Cape Breton or for Inverness did try to participate, to listen to what the minister had to say, to see what organizations had to say, but was asked to leave that. The discussion paper brought back had divided results, Mr. Speaker. The committee heard representations that were divided. The Labour Management Review Committee couldn't even come to a consensus, as was presented by the member for Cape Breton West, Mr. Speaker. Then only a few days later, this government, after all that questioning, came and introduced first contract legislation into this House. And not only, Mr. Speaker, did it introduce first contract legislation, it introduced the most anti-business model of first contract arbitration in the country. You know, many times we've heard through the paper, through the media, talking about the 6 provinces that have this. Well, maybe Nova Scotia could accept some kind of first contract arbitration, but not this one. Maybe they could accept in other provinces. But since this consultation necessarily didn't happen, we're into a place where we're either for this one or against it. Maybe there's some updating. Maybe there's some time to consult and actually come up with something that's going to work for everyone. In fact, it reminds me of the consultation that happened around Bill 100. In our mind, another piece of extreme anti-business legislation. As was the case with the NDP's Bill 100, members of the business community and other stakeholders are hardly given the opportunity to make their case to government. Instead, this was a last-minute process designed to really just silence some opposition from the members of the business community in Nova Scotia. So proceedings like this, in a way this government has done, can only damage the relationship between the government of Nova Scotia and businesses in our province. These job creators, Mr. Speaker, are the backbone of our economy. They deserve more respect than this. They deserve to have their voices heard. And that's why it's so important that we wait on this, that we make sure the business community has been properly consulted and has had their voices heard. After all, they're job creators. They are the people who will have to deal with the consequences of this misguided legislation. Shouldn't the government at least take the time to hear what they have to say? One of the most serious problems with the consultation process that this government has put together is the very nature of it, Mr. Speaker. It does nothing to foster a healthy relationship between the members of the government and the job creators. In fact, it creates controversy. It makes it harder for all of us. Matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, it really kind of looks like a sort of a divide and conquer tactic. So then while everybody's not getting along, the government can sweep in and really do what it wants. And that's why we should wait. The government and job creators should be working hand in hand to help grow the economy. Instead, because of this government's, what we feel, adversarial approach to first contract arbitration or legislation, we've seen that relationship already sour because of the Bill 100 fiasco deteriorate even further. And I know that the Minister of Economic Development will see the fallout of this legislation and really should be lobbying at the cabinet table to maybe have this one put off until true consultation is actually taken. So to wait, Mr. Speaker, to hold off for this for 6 months would give the government and the business community enough time to come together in a proper consultation period. Let's also remember the purpose of the Labour Management Review Committee is to improve labour relations in Nova Scotia and to provide a forum for the business community and the labour community to discuss important issues relevant to them. Instead, the government has actually been using the committee to forge ahead with its own anti-business agenda. And it's not just that the government hasn't given the business community enough time to engage in a proper consultation process. That's not the only reason to wait for this. The government hasn't properly made their case yet either, where the empirical evidence that shows us first contract arbitration is needed in Nova Scotia in the first time. So where is that data? In fact, all of the evidence I have seen suggests that we are pretty harmonious. And we've had pretty harmonious relations with labor in this province. Hundreds of collective agreements get ratified each year in Nova Scotia. That all happens without strikes or lockouts. So why has the government placed such a high priority on first contract arbitration now? Nova Scotia has had a work stoppage rate that is below, Mr. Speaker, the national average. That's extremely impressive. So why are we doing this now? Why are we moving ahead with first contract arbitration? The government has yet to make its case, and we're all waiting to hear it. We spent lots of time talking about this bad piece of legislation and that it is a bad piece of legislation, but I would like to spend some time talking about why this is a bad time, why this isn't the time for first contract arbitration, and why we should delay. Businesses in Nova Scotia are already feeling the pinch. They're already suffering from too much at the hands of this government. Let's look at the HST. When the NDP raised the HST, they made it harder for businesses, especially small business. That hike, the NDP's HST hike, took money out of people's pockets. It's given them less disposable incomes. And who does this hurt? That hurts grocery stores, convenience stores, gas stations. These are all important businesses that already feel the pinch. They can't afford first contract arbitration. They can't afford that out now. Or let's look at power rates. We have the second highest power rates in the country, thanks to this government. Job creators like NewPage and Port Hawkesbury have said it. They've told us power rates have hurt our business, they've hurt our bottom line, and it's all due to this government's bite the bullet energy plan. And of course, there's our regulatory burden. This NDP's regulatory policies have hindered business, hindered entire sectors of our economy, and now, when we have to look at the current challenges that our businesses face, it's clear that this isn't the time to experiment with first contract arbitration. Maybe if we had a mass labor discontent in Nova Scotia, the government could justify moving ahead. But we don't. We don't have labor discontent. And it's clear that the existing provisions of the Trade Union Act already provide protection for any improper bargaining tactic by either employers or unions. These provisions, these protections, Mr. Speaker, have worked so far. They've actually worked quite well. So again, why now? There's no need for any interference with collective bargaining through first contract arbitration. This bill, if it's passed, will only make harder for unions and job creators to build those important relationships. We shouldn't only be considering the relationship between job creators and unions, we also should be mindful of the relationship government should be maintaining with job creators in the business community. And this process, proceeding with this legislation this way, does nothing to improve those relations between the government and business. And we should all know that that's an important relationship. So supporting a hoist motion, which I got to say, Mr. Speaker, again, is a way for us to slow down this process. It's not just a dilatory motion or a way to hold this up. We actually want people to consider waiting a little bit, truly doing the consultation that's important to them. Because it's important that we grow our economy, that we really work with the job creators. Mr. Speaker, I want to look at, to know whether the government has actually met and consulted with the roundtable members. Has the Minister of Labour or the Premier or anyone from the government side reached out to Bowater Mercy about this issue? I know they're busy with other things, but have they talked about contract arbitration with them? What about Clearwater Fine Foods? Clearwater is an important company with a history here in Nova Scotia. Surely they deserve to be consulted. Crossley Tendus is another important participant at the Employers Roundtable. And I wonder what they think of this first contract arbitration. Does the government know? Have they taken the time to ask or consult? Here's an interesting fact. Irving is a participant on the Employers Roundtable. And we all know that Irving was recently awarded that $25 billion shipbuilding contract. And all members of this House, all Nova Scotians, were excited by that. Rightly so. But in the years to come, Irving will have some important decisions to make. They're going to have to subcontract some of that work. And when they're deciding where some of that work will go, how can we be sure that it will be done in Nova Scotia? The truth is that we can't be sure of that. But what we can do is create an environment where Irving wants to work, where they want that work to be done, where it's advantageous to have that work done here in Nova Scotia. And then there's things we can do to make that happen. We can lower taxes. We can get to work on lower power rates. We can lessen the regulatory burden. on the regulatory burden that businesses face. But there's also some things that we can do to make it harder for Irving to send that work here too, to make it harder for Irving to justify sending that work to Nova Scotia. And one of these things, in our mind, is again first contract arbitration. Another member of the roundtable is Sobeys. Sobeys employs Nova Scotians from one end of this province to the other. Sobeys has a deeply rooted history in Nova Scotia. Are we willing to sacrifice that deeply rooted history with first contract arbitration? These are the kind of questions the government should be spending time pondering before we move ahead on this bill. That's why it's important. That's why a hoist motion at this point makes sense. I talked about Walmart when I had the opportunity to speak before. They're a major employer in Nova Scotia, and there's been a lot of examples where Walmart's in other jurisdictions, I'm talking about Quebec, where Walmart has simply moved jobs and closed down departments because a first contract was imposed upon them. Do we want that to happen at Walmart's here in Nova Scotia? Do you think, honestly, Mr. Speaker, that we can afford that? And there's more. There's lots of other members of the Employers Roundtable who don't feel that they've been consulted properly. Members like Dalhousie University, ECPLP, Farmers Dairy, IMP, Killam Properties, Medavie Blue Cross, Michelin Mount St. Vincent University, Dexter's, Nova Scotia Power, Oxford Frozen Foods, Scotia Investments, Scotsburns Dairy, the Shaw Group. Mr. Speaker, don't they deserve a say on this one? You know, many people have been coming before this House to talk about this, different organizations, you know, the Atlantic Building Supply Dealers Association, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, Canadian Restaurant and Food Services Association, Construction Association Nova Scotia, the Canadian Taxpayers Association, the Halifax Chamber of Commerce, Hotel Association of Nova Scotia, Merit Contractors of Nova Scotia Automobile Dealers Association, Nova Scotia Chambers of Commerce, Nova Scotia Home Builders Association, Nova Scotia Road Builders Association, Restaurant Association Nova Scotia, Retail Council of Canada Atlantic Office, Sackville Business Association, Scotia Group of Companies, Tourism Industry Association Nova Scotia, and the Truro and District Chamber of Commerce have all come forward to oppose this legislation today. That's an awful lot of people that these folks represent. These groups combined employ thousands upon thousands of Nova Scotians. Why has this government refused to work with them on this? You know, I'll guess that the members of the government, you know, I'll give them the benefit of doubt. If they're busy killing jobs, so maybe they haven't had time to read their letter. For the benefit of the members on the government side, you know, I think we should take the opportunity to, of course, discuss it. Let's look at some of the organizations and consider the impact that they will have on our economy. The Canadian Restaurant and Food Services Association, employing thousands upon thousands of Nova Scotians across our province, have opposed the bill. Again, the Nova Scotia Home Builders Association is important contributors to our province's economy. They've called on the government to put an end to first contract arbitration scheme. The Nova Scotia Road Builders Association, we depend on them for so much, Mr. Speaker. They too have come forward and asked the government not to forge ahead with this dangerous legislation. And what do these groups have in common? They have the potential to disrupt collective bargaining. What it does is it deprives of parties of finality in the most important contract that they'll ever negotiate, which of course is their first contract. Mr. Speaker, I would love to stand and continue speaking on this bill, and I just might continue to speak it on a later date, but I would like to maybe adjourn debate on this bill so that the House Leader can book business for tomorrow.
The motion before the House is that we adjourn debate. Ready for the question? All those in favor? Aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable, the Government House Leader on tomorrow's business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that concludes the government's business for today. When we meet tomorrow, we will be doing bills for second reading, Bill 94, 95, 96, 98, 100, 102, 104, 106, 108, 109, 110, 111, 112, and go in committee the whole on Bills 65, 73, 76, 78, 80, 84, and 85. I wish you to now rise, Mr. Speaker, to meet from the hours of 9 p.m. to 12 midnight. 9 a.m.
The motion before the host is that we now do rise and meet from the hours of 9 a.m. to 12 midnight. You're ready for the question? All those in favor? Motion is carried. We shall now rise until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. We have now reached the moment of interruption. There was a draw earlier today. The resolution for discussion tonight is therefore be resolved that the Premier recognize the employment crisis in rural Nova Scotia and direct the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism to devise a job strategy which includes targets and measurable outcomes. And it was submitted by the Honourable Member from Cape Breton South. We will start the debate. The Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This serious issue that rural Nova Scotia is facing is part of a trend. I believe there is a crisis. We've seen the numbers come out from Stats Canada, and I know for a fact that all of us, every single member from a rural riding, has experienced this negative trend back home. We've experienced when our constituents come into our office because they're out of work and don't know how they're going to provide for their families. We experience it when someone comes into our office and says, I'm not working, I can't afford my power bill this month. What do? We experience it when our storefronts in our downtowns close. We experience it when employers leave, and oftentimes the employees follow suit. There is a problem in rural Nova Scotia. The economy of that area is changing, and we have not had a government in place that has chosen to react to this or be proactive in stopping the bleeding that's happening in rural Nova Scotia. And instead of even acknowledging that it's an issue, instead of saying, yes, we realize that there's challenges in our rural communities, there are job losses, there are people that are struggling, there are families that are forced to move elsewhere, either to Halifax or beyond the borders of Nova Scotia. Instead of even acknowledging that, we have a Premier that stands up and treats this serious issue, this vital issue, that's affecting thousands of Nova Scotians and their families. We have a Premier that stands up and treats this crisis with indifference. We hear, no, there's no problem. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. We have a Minister of Economic and Rural Development that instead of realizing this is an issue, this is a trend that's happening in our rural communities, and that our province is actually